Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
And Junius, it's been a while since we've been able to record. How have you been?
It's been a busy summer. Had a lot going on in my life and a lot of work to do and whatever, but I'm glad to be on this side of it and facing the exciting challenges of the new year.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, do you want to confess one of the reasons why it's been so so long?
Yes, I do. Actually, thank you, Father, for bless me, Father, for I've sinned. I was traveling on a business trip, and I had Anscombe with me on the plane, and I was reading very dutifully on the plane. And I walked off the plane and I left my book and my reading glasses on the plane and didn't realize it until I got to my destination later that day. So I wound up having to buy another copy of the book and another pair of reading glasses. And that kind of set me back on my reading a bit.
That's right. And we should say you did so unintentionally.
Well, I'm not sure, right? I mean, maybe that's something we'll be able to judge better at the end of the broadcast.
That's right. Yes. So sorry for the delay in getting this out. We were talking briefly before we jumped on just in terms of scheduling. We will do one more episode in this season. We're going to do Thus Spake Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. And then we'll have our draft coming out soon for the next season. There will be some listener choice episodes in there, but if you really want us to consider something, you can always drop a comment on the Substack in the group chat or in the comments of this episode, and we'll be happy to at least take it into account. And if it doesn't get into the season, you can nominate it for one of the listener choice episodes. So today we're going to talk about Intention by G E M Anscombe, and we thought maybe it would be good to start out with a little biography of her. GEM stands for Gertrude Elizabeth Margaret Anscombe, who was born in Ireland around 1919. I think this might be one of the latest works that we've done on the show. Mm-hmm. Maybe Sertalange's The Intellectual Life. I don't remember his dates, but I imagine he was somewhat around there. Mm-hmm. Anscombe's really a very interesting figure. She inhabits a movement called analytic philosophy, which we'll talk about in a minute. But she really comes at it from a kind of Thomistic perspective. So she is often credited with being the founder of analytical Thomism. Her father was a schoolmaster. Her mother was a headmistress and a scholar herself. And so, of course, in her own upbringing, she was very intellectually curious. She was also, I think as an early teenager, a convert to the Roman Catholic Church, which really influences quite a bit of her work. She went to Oxford and she studied classics and philosophy there. I think she graduated around 1941. And then she did some postgrad stuff at Cambridge, where she met and became friends with Wittgenstein, who is a German philosopher. And she really appreciated his work. In fact, she translated a good amount of his work into English. But really, her big work of her own career was this book that we're discussing today, which is about intention. And so, yeah, she was a really cool person, I think, just a very brilliant person. And she actually passed away in 2001, which doesn't feel that long ago. So she's quite a profound philosopher who is often overlooked. I had not been very familiar with Anscombe until I heard Dr. Jennifer Fr, now at Tulsa University, talking about her on a podcast somewhere. So that's kind of the background. Junius, have you engaged at all with Anscombe's work before this?
I have not. No, this is my first time with Anscombe, and I do want to just, if we could pat ourselves on the back one more time here, note that with this text, we have brought the classical mind into the 21st century. Since the author died in 2001. So we've now, that completes the classical tradition. Thank you all for joining us on this journey.
That's right.
No, I hadn't read her before, and it's I've known the name. She has fallen into that space of text where I have to be self-protective. And what I mean by that is there's a desire as a young graduate student, whenever somebody mentions something, to think you've got to read it and you've got to know it, and people keep mentioning things and there's only a certain amount of time, and so every really every person, I was going to say every scholar, but every person has to at some point decide what they're okay knowing and not knowing.
Yes.
Because if you don't, you're just going to be filled with regret all the time, and shame, and various other sorts of things. And so she was someone who I was like, oh yeah, I bet that's really fascinating, but I just can't get to it. I've got to set that aside. So I was excited for this chance to actually have an excuse to get into her work and see what's going on there.
Yes, absolutely. And we should say, I think this goes all the way back to the episode we did on the intellectual life, which was one of our first episodes, that not only is it a necessary thing to be able to limit oneself and say, well, that's just not something I should be reading right now. It's actually a virtue.
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Curiositas is a vice.
Yeah.
Splitting from one thing to another, never being very disciplined in our reading. So we have the excuse now of, well, we have to read it for the podcast. Right. But generally speaking, especially in terms of your own intellectual career and development, yeah, sometimes there are books you have to say, I'm sure it's good, but it's not something I need to read right now.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, so let me talk a little bit about the philosophical school that she belongs to. We call this, so there are different types of philosophy, and even that description is not as precise as I would like, because you could say, well, yes, we know there's like metaphysics, which is sort of philosophy of being, and then there's epistemology, and there's ethics, and these sorts of things, and that's not what I mean. There are two different fundamental ways of, well, in the West, there have emerged two different fundamental ways of doing philosophy that you could see them as largely stemming, the one from Plato and the one from Aristotle, although I think that's a bit unfair to both Plato and Aristotle. We just class these as the continental method of doing philosophy versus the analytical method of doing philosophy. A continental method of doing philosophy is going to have a lot of, there's space for poetic language, and there's space for a lot of intuition, and phenomenology belongs to that stream of things and whatnot. And then on the other side, you get analytic philosophy, which is deeply rooted in logic, and especially symbolic logic. And in close analysis of language and common sense intuitions, these sorts of things. These are both really good ways of doing philosophy, and they bring with them a lot of advantages. But as it's turned out, historically, they have split off into opposing schools that are fairly hostile to one another. So it's very rare to find a philosopher who is conversant in both sides of the stream. And typically, if you're thinking about going to graduate school in philosophy, you've got to think about, do you want to be in a continental department or an analytic department? And if you go to a school that is an analytical school, but they keep a token continental philosopher around, well, that's going to mark you while you're there if you go there to study with that person. So it's kind of this strange artificial separation between the two. I mention it because if the philosophy you've read before has been stuff like Plato, even to a certain extent Aquinas, Augustine, things like that, and you come to Anscombe, it's not going to be very familiar. It's going to feel very different, and it's going to feel very challenging. This is a text that you do have to read slowly with a great deal of attention. You have to read sentences over and over again, because it is incredibly, almost obnoxiously meticulous, right? I trained in at a school where the dominant philosophy was analytical. And so this was a major part of my graduate studies. Before I had gone to graduate school, I spent more time in continental philosophy. And so I kind of had this weird juxtaposition going on. But I was taught that the philosophical virtues of analytical philosophy are concision and precision. So you don't want to take a long time to say things. Say it as quickly and efficiently as possible, and also say it as precisely as possible. There can't really be any room for, well, maybe you mean this, or maybe you mean that, or whatever else. And so that's why if you started reading this book and you look at it and you think, wow, it's a pretty small book, actually. Mm-hmm. This is great. Sometimes they pick these massive ones. No, this is going to be great. This might take you longer to read than a book 3 or 4 times its size, because the precise conciseness of it makes it incredibly dense. And so reading a page, my reading speed for stuff like this is way below my reading speed for a novel, and even for reading Plato. So that's just something to know. That's one of the challenges of reading the text. And that's not you being slow, or you being dumb, or anything like that. That's just the nature of this type of writing. You're meant to slow down over it and take a bunch of time with it. In fact, the philosophy department at Yale where I studied, they assigned typically 10 to 20 pages of reading a week. Whether you understand, whereas in theology, we were getting 100, 150 pages of reading a week. And I'll never forget when one of the philosophers, I was talking to him about how much work I had to do. And he goes, "You theologians read too much," which is a funny thing to say. But when I came to understand what he meant, it was that, you got to read more slowly. You got to read with more attention to detail. And this type of philosophy really, really demands that.
Yes. On this note, I think is it Wittgenstein's Tractatus where he numbers everything?
Yes.
And the numbers kind of move in further indented as he gets more specific in that point, but then they come out. So in theory, you can read it just the furthest out numbers. But then if you want to elaborate on the claim, which is a very helpful way of structuring a text. In fact, I wish more people actually structure text like that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you're exactly right. It is. I read the Tractatus a long time ago, and it was a painstaking read.
Yes.
It took me forever to get through, and it took me a very long time to get through this book, despite the fact that it's 90 pages.
Yeah, and a lot of it's one of those things where you're not going to get delight from this book at the level of the way she's talking. The delight is going to come from the concepts, and you've got to really, it's a much more abstract kind of thing. Whereas with Plato is very literary at the same time that it's very good philosophy. And there are aspects of Plato that are quite complicated and quite difficult and involved. I mean, it's not as if Plato is easy philosophy and this is hard philosophy, but there's just a difference in how it's presented. Here, analytical philosophy strips away everything that might distract you from the argument and asks you to spend your full attention on the argument itself.
I will say there are some places where her personality pokes through a little bit, and I do really enjoy those places.
She can be very funny, actually.
She's very witty and hilarious, and you can tell at times kind of sarcastic as well. In fact, the person who owned this book previously has a couple places where they put LOL in big caps, besides certain things she says.
Well, and this is one of the things that I really like about analytic philosophers is that they, while the strictest of them, like Wittgenstein, I don't remember him ever being funny. It's just get the work done. He's German. But sure. the best of them, folks like Nick Walterstorff and Alvin Plantinga and these guys, they will use the examples they choose to illustrate their points as a way of introducing some humor and lightening the mood of the text a little bit. And I really appreciate that. And that's something that I do in my own teaching. If I'm teaching really dense stuff and I need to use an example, well, let's pick a funny example so that we can all have a bit of a laugh, right?
Yes, for sure.
And Anscombe does that as well.
Yeah, she does have a good sense of humor. I get the feeling she was much more fun to be around than Wittgenstein was, but that's probably a different podcast.
Yes, get that sense too.
So one thing we should maybe talk about is contextualizing the work. So obviously when we're talking about intention, we're talking about kind of the sort of the why behind an action. She may disagree with my characterization of that because it's not quite precise enough, but generally speaking, that's what we're talking about. And she is asking these questions in a context in which kind of there had been two explanations of intention already offered, and in fact they were sort of the predominant views of her day. So the first is what we might call behaviorism, which basically would argue that all of our actions are learned responses from some sort of external environmental stimuli, right? And so in this view, it's really important when you're trying to determine someone's intention to look at the observable behavior, and the mental state behind the behavior really is not important because it's not observable. And so the behavioralist would see action as conditioned response. And so the idea of conditioning, for example, would be a big thing that a behavioralist would look at, because actions are acquired through learning processes. And so, and one can certainly see some truth in this. What makes an action, if somebody's doing the wrong thing, we would say, well, that's very significant. But there is always kind of a why behind it, and the why may mitigate. I think it's Aquinas who talks about this. Like if somebody steals bread because they need to feed their family, there's certainly a more nuanced approach to that than someone who just steals because they enjoy stealing.
Yeah, that was Les Mis.
Well, that's true too. Yeah, right. The whole novel of it. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. So that's one way of explaining action that she's kind of pushing up against. The other is a kind of causalism, which views actions as events that come about by both mental states, like beliefs and desires, and also external circumstances. And so there's a little more emphasis on the internal mental event to guide one's behavior. But there is a kind of milieu in which those events happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and what's you might be helpful to think about what might one be concerned about in each of these approaches, which are fairly opposite to one another, right? And the problem with behaviorism is that it could run the risk of reducing everything to external causes. Everything's purely external, and so it becomes a kind of determinism at the end of the day. But it also, it relativizes the interior life. The mental states just become fairly uninteresting because they're not really the source of the actions anyway, and that doesn't line up with our experience of the world. And this is interesting. It's very important for analytic philosophy that you take account of how the world presents itself to a normal human being. And so, because philosophers are always coming up with counterintuitive things, right? Oh, well, you think there's a physical object there, but really it's just a projection of your mind, but there may or may not be, right? Like, well, that's crazy. Analytical philosophy takes seriously that we have those impressions, and it wants to say, well, what could explain that? Like, why would I have that expression, that impression? On the other hand, causalism, it makes the exterior world almost kind of dispensable. And it arrives at determinism almost by a completely different sort of path, right? That if everything is explained in terms of these antecedent causes, then ultimately you can just keep following the causal chain back, and no particular thing is responsible for its agency. Its agency as a result of something that came before it, that acted upon it, and so on and so forth. Both of those those places you can wind up are contrary to the way we experience ourselves as intentional beings who choose, who have things that we want to accomplish in the ways that we act.
In many ways, these map onto the sort of what we call nature nurture debate. You can see both formalism or behavioralism and causalism as being kind of the extremes of that. When in reality, I think at least from a sort of classical Christian perspective, there's things that are true in both of those, but they don't fully account for the why behind someone's actions. They
not the whole story.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating that it's very interesting for her to choose intention specifically as what she's going to home in on, and to cordon it off from the questions of free will and determinism, which this conversation butts up against over and over again.
That's right.
And there's a rich and long tradition of philosophical reflection on free will and determinism, and yet there's very little, tempted to say hardly anything, written about intention before Anscombe comes to it.
Very true. Did you want to maybe here talk a little bit about equivocal, univocal, and analogical predication, or did you want to do that later?
Yeah, this is a good time. Well, actually, just before we do that, I do want to mention, just as another way of getting into how to read this book and what's useful about this book. In the very beginning of it, there's a section called Contents. And down the left-hand side, you'll see numbers, and over top of them, there's the symbol for section. And so those are the section numbers in the text. And on the right-hand side, you'll see numbers, and that column is labeled page. And so you can see the distinction between, okay, this is section 1 on page 1, but by the time we get to section 6, we're on between pages 9 and 11, otherwise known as 10. What this is a list of the things that are going to be argued in each section of the text. And so by the time you follow this out to the 52nd section of the text, which is finishes on page 91, what you will have seen is an outline of the argument. This is super helpful because of what we were talking about before. The prose is very dense. It can be very hard to read. It's tiring, especially if you haven't built up muscles for reading this way. My analytic philosophy muscles are a little rusty, and so I found it tiring at first. I think one of the reasons I left my book on the plane was that I went to sleep and set it down between my leg and the armrest. I went to sleep, and then I forgot it when I got up. So this is a great way to, first of all, if you're not accustomed to reading a lot of analytic philosophy, I highly recommend you spend your first amount of time just reading through these contents and reading through them carefully and trying to follow how they proceed from one to the other. And then also, as you're reading, it's good to refer back to this. And she's talking deeply about, what happens if the doctor hits you on the knee with a hammer and your leg jerks involuntarily and blah, blah, blah. You're like, wait, why are we talking about this? Go back to the section number. It'll help you understand that this is an example of specifically that thing. So this is one of the really, really helpful aspects of this book.
My only complaint about the format here, because you're exactly right, these are super helpful. I wish that the sections, when you actually encounter them on the page numbers, had these headings, right?
Yes.
Headings would solve a lot of people's problems. I was recently working on getting a book republished written by an Anglican scholar in the 20th century. And it's a brilliant book, but he jumps around in his argument, and it's just like, just put some stuff in some headings and you'll help people so much more. And I think the same principle is true here. Though sometimes the headings or the headings would be as long as the paragraph just about, because the contents section is pretty, the contents themselves take up 8 pages.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that's why, referring back to them can be a helpful way of keeping yourself on task, because it is very easy to lose the thread of the argument when you're in the weeds of it. Okay, yeah, let's talk a little bit about, so I want to talk about equivocation and whatnot. And the reason why is because when we talk, there's several times in the argument when different senses of the word come up, right? And so you could say like, did you intend to cause that war? And there's different ways you could answer that, right? Well, in one sense, I didn't intend the outcome that was the war, but I did intend the action that led to the war, knowing that it might possibly lead to the war, and various other sorts of things. We use the word intention in different ways. And we also use words like prediction, which is an important discussion in here, in different ways. And there's a classic understanding of the ways the different meanings of a word, different uses of a word in different contexts can be related to each other. And this is actually it's really an ancient discussion. It goes back to Aristotle, but Plato's already dealing with it. And one of the central questions in Plato interpretation, and I think it's the difference between Neoplatonists and Platonists, is, do you read Plato more in terms of univocal predication or analogical predication? The univocal readings of Plato wind up in Neoplatonic places, and analogical readings wind up in Platonic places. So what's that mean? Well, let's take an example. I'd like to use the example of good. And so let's say I can say that God is good, and I can say that it's good that my family is healthy, and I can say good dog. Now the question is, I'm using the same adjective over and over again, good, but does it mean the same thing in every instance? If it did, if what it meant for the dog to be good and what it meant for God to be good were the same thing, then that would be univocal predication. That is to say, I'm using the word with one meaning, una vox. If it's different things, right? Like when I say good dog, I mean that the dog does what I want him to do at the time that I want him to do it. On command, right? But when I say God is good, hopefully that's not what I mean. Hopefully I mean something more lofty than that and less dependent upon my own personal desires and whatnot. So you might say, well, those are just two different concepts entirely. And it had been better if I had just used a different word for the dog, right? God is good and the dog is faithful, or whatever the thing is, right? That would be equivocation, using the same word with different meanings. This is why equivocation can be a logical fallacy. right? Because I can tell you that, well, you say that you like, oh, this is a good example. Let's say your daughter comes to you and says that she wants you to treat her like a princess. And you say, okay. And so then you force her to marry a stranger at the age of 12, because that's what happened to princesses back in the day, right? Well, there's some equivocation going on there. She doesn't mean the same thing by princess that you're meaning there. And in a way, you're intentionally misunderstanding what she's meaning in order to make a point. Not all equivocation is bad or fallacious or vicious. Equivocation does have proper good uses. Puns are a great example, right? Puns thrive on intentionally abusing the meanings of words. But you have to look out for them, because they can be vicious in arguments where they try to import extra stuff and make you, convince you of things you shouldn't be convinced of by that argument. Well, so, okay.
It's a fallacy of clarity, right?
It is. That's right.
Because you're obfuscating what's really being said through the swapping of meanings. And so me and you could be using the same term, but meaning different things by it, which can create a lot of problems in terms of our conversation. It's not that we necessarily even really disagree. It's that we might be using this term with different ideas behind it.
Yeah. One of the joys of doing this podcast with you is that I don't find us in those types of impasses very often.
Not often. Just that one time.
Just that one time. Yeah. For which I apologize. And if that does, if it ever does happen, I think we're both aware we might be saying the same thing here. We're just in different ways, or we have different things that we're trying to exclude or whatever else. Well, okay. So either the word can mean exactly the same thing all the times you use it, or it can mean totally different things that really have no relationship to each other, univocity and equivocity. But there's got to be a middle ground, right? And the middle ground is analogical. And that's the answer to the God is good. It's good that my family is healthy and good dog dilemma, which is that while the fact that it's good that my family is healthy is not, their good doesn't mean the same thing it means when I say God is good or the dog is good, either one. Nevertheless, all three of those are related to a single idea. They don't mean entirely different things either. And so the question you can imagine, let's say you arrive at heaven, or you have a mystical vision or whatever, and you see God and you see the goodness of God. Are you going to say, ooh, I really shouldn't have been calling things good before. Only this is good. That would be to settle on equivocation. Or if you want to say, yeah, God's a good dog, that would be univocity. More likely what you'll say, the idea is, see, that's it. That right there, that's what I was going for all those times I called other things good. They participated in what I'm seeing there, and that's the important thing. Okay, so how does that go ahead?
Theologically, that I think is how we preserve a sense of mystery too, right? When we're talking about God versus when we're talking about the creature. I mean, when we're talking about this, it makes me think of the way C.S. Lewis depicts Aslan. He's a good lion, but he's not a tame lion, meaning he can't be contained in sort of our univocal boxes.
Yeah.
So there has to be some room there for mystery, and I think it's true maybe in a different analogical way when we're talking about creaturely senses. I mean, there has to be room for difference when we're talking to the other or about the other, right? That while we're human, we may have different experiences and different things. And so while there may be universals that are true about us, what that looks like, we have to kind of allow for some room.
Yeah. I think that's right. And so then how does that apply to this text? Well, I think it comes up precisely because her strategy when faced with different ways that we can mean a word like the title word intention is the strategy is consistently not to say, well, okay, this sense in which we use it is just, we shouldn't be using it in bad sense. No, she's going to say, yeah, I get it. Like we use it in all these different ways and we know what we mean when we use it in all these different ways, and yet it's hard to express. And she's going to say, I think that the reason we wind up in that situation is because there is a relationship between the different ways we use it. There is an underlying thing that is intention, and all of these ways in which we use the word I intend are gesturing at different aspects of it. And so if we follow them all out, we should be able to arrive at the core concept that they're all expressions of.
In fact, at the very beginning of the book, she says, it is implausible to say that the word is equivocal as it occurs in these different cases. She lays out the 3 different cases at the very beginning of ways you might use intention. And she goes on to say, let's see, I just lost my place here. It's impossible to say that the word is equivocal as it occurs in these different cases, and from the fact that we are tempted to speak of different senses of a word, which is clearly not equivocal, we may infer that we are pretty much in the dark about the character of the concept which it represents.
Yeah. And that's a general claim she's saying. Anytime you're tempted to speak of different senses of a word and the senses are not just equivalent, let's say there's some relationship between them, we can infer that we don't really actually know the underlying concept that we're gesturing at. That's possibly how she came to thinking, I'm going to do this work on intention, right? She's looking at these things and she's thinking, okay, my intuition is that these are not merely equivocal. It doesn't seem plausible that these would just be equivocal, but I don't see how they're connected. There's a project I can work on. And I think she's right. You know, I made the point earlier that there's almost nothing written in philosophy about the notion of intention before her. And what I mean is just this philosophy about, like, you know, why people do things and the types of reasons people give for stuff, but like specifically, what is a philosophical account of the concept of intending something? She's almost the first word in that discussion. The reason why is because it's exactly the kind of thing that goes undiscussed for a long time, because we intuitively know what we mean, but it resists being pressed into being explained well. In fact, I think she gives a couple of good examples of this right at the beginning. And this is something that I find happening a lot in philosophy. There's something that's intuitive and every person understands it, but then you go to give a rigorous theoretical account of it and you're just like, I don't know how I'm going to do that. And one of her examples is, I'm going to fail this exam, which everyone understands that except for in the joke situation, this is a prediction and not an intention. But how do you define the distinction between prediction and intention such that we can account for this meaning that? Especially given that there is the joke situation, which looks something like this. You know, a husband is sitting at the breakfast table and he's eating his breakfast and he says to his wife, I'm going to be late for work today. And she goes, oh no. And she like starts bustling around and grabbing his stuff and here are your keys, here's your briefcase. And he says, no, you don't understand. I'm going to be late for work today. She took it as a prediction. He meant it as an intention. How do we account for that distinction theoretically? Anscombe shows that it's quite difficult.
In some ways, I feel like the way that she brings up these different nuances, and it feels like she's always complicating the issue. I mean, she's clarifying by bringing up these other wrinkles that we have to consider. Yeah. But I do feel like it's almost, instead of a Platonic dialogue, it becomes a Platonic monologue, right? It's got the same quality of it. You read Plato and he'll ask a very simple question: what is justice? And by the end of the dialogue, we've considered, you know, a million different theories and examples and all these things. And you kind of think at the end, I think I might know less about what justice is than I did before. And I think something's kind of similar here, just in terms of the quality of what she's doing, that there is a lot of examples and a lot of nuance and distinctions that are made that are true and necessary to do. But yeah, one wonders, do I really understand intention better now that I've read this book?
Yeah. So sometimes the result of reading a book of philosophy like this is that you know what's wrong with all the possible definitions you can give, but you still don't have one you can offer on your own. This is very comparable to me to a discussion that often I've had a lot with other musicians, because among classical musicians are not surprisingly a very opinionated lot in the field, in the realm of taste. And so there are certain things you're allowed to like and certain things you're not allowed to like and you're supposed to look down on. And one of the things you're supposed to look down on are the musicals of Andrew Lloyd Webber, because as best I can tell, the reason you're supposed to look down on them is because they're really popular and he's made $1 billion. And so, like, you know, you can't make $1 billion doing classical music, so he must not be one of us, right? He's successful. And there's part of a larger sense that operas are really excellent and high culture and important and stuff, and musicals are crass and simple and whatever else, right? And so then you ask one of these people, all right, so what's the difference between an opera and a musical? Like on the surface of it, they're the same type of thing. You get people on the stage running around and committing all sorts of hijinks and singing about it while they do it. And you want to say, well, you know, in an opera, they sing the whole thing. There's recitative, whereas in a musical, they talk. Well, no, because in the Magic Flute, it's called a Singspiel. They talk between the songs. They don't do recitative except for in a few small places. That's not going to work. And you go through and you give all these different criteria for what it can be. And I've ultimately given up on trying to distinguish between the two because I feel like any distinction that anyone has ever offered between an opera and a musical breaks on two data points. Porgy and Bess is written by a jazz composer. It's sung in a Broadway musical style, and it is considered an opera. And Candide is, this is a West Side Story. West Side Story is written by Bernstein, not only one of the great composers of the 20th century, but conductors, but also a great composer of classical music, director of the New York Philharmonic, and is sung in an operatic style, and it's considered a musical.
Interesting.
Right. And so that's, at the end of the day, what I say to musicians arguing about that is this distinction probably doesn't hold up because you can't give me a positive account of why I should have this distinction. It sort of comes down to, well, this is highbrow and that's lowbrow, which is just prejudice at the end of the day. So that's the danger of a text like this, where she's knocking down all of these possible things you could set up as accounts of intention, is at the end of the day, you might conclude, well, maybe there is no meaningful thing to be said here, right? Maybe there is no one concept of intention. Maybe you were wrong to think that we shouldn't treat this equivocally at the beginning.
Can I offer two comments? Number one is I love musicals, especially Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Yes.
That's my confession. I think Jesus Christ Superstar, theologically not great, but one of my favorite musicals.
We should do a bonus episode on Jesus Christ Superstar.
Oh, can we?
Yes,
that would
please.
be. Let's do it. I would really like to do that. I'm being 100% serious.
Me too.
The new one on NBC with John Legend, I thought was actually really good, but we'll get sidetracked. So the other thing is maybe I could try to summarize a positive articulation of her argument, and you tell me if you think this is an okay way of describing what she's doing here.
Mm-hmm.
So intention is not mental states or causes of actions.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, intention is found somehow kind of in the actual action itself. And so there is a high value placed on the kind of, I guess we might call it practical knowledge of the actor, who also would know their reason for acting. I'm doing X to accomplish Y, you know, but that's wrapped up in the action itself. And so then you can go a little further in that, and you can make certain distinctions in action. That is like what is actually happening while the person is doing the thing, like the guy who was pumping the water while poisoning the family. You know, his arm is moving, but he can place that motion into a larger picture of he's filling up the water tank, so that he can poison the family.
Yeah.
So there's intention in the action, but there's also a kind of prior intention, which is the plan, right? He arrived. He had to come to this place knowing what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of unity there. They're not really two separate intentions, but rather one intention with two movements, perhaps. And so really, in fact, a good deal of this, like the guy who his leg moves when he's hit on the knee with the hammer. There's a sense in which sometimes the action is done sort of, or the knowledge of the action is achieved without a sort of, I guess, observation. Like, in other words, the agent can understand their action without mapping out like when I hold the pen, I'm holding it, but my mind is not consciously going through each of my 5 fingers grasping. I'm just sort of making the movement, and of course my fingers wrapping around the pen is one of the corollaries of that action.
Yeah I think that's definitely on the right track. This notion of things that we know non-observationally was, I thought, a really fascinating part of the book and a really helpful part of the discussion. And it connects up to a medieval discussion. And I'm going to bring that to bear because I think it offers resources that are helpful to this. And I'm justified in doing so because you mentioned that she's a kind of Thomist. And so now the whole Middle Ages are very open to me. So it's your fault. There's a distinction in scholastic theology between something that's an internal instrument and an external instrument. And an external instrument, for example, listeners, I'm holding a pen. It's a Pilot G2 black, 0.7.
The best kind.
Which is absolutely. I was an early adopter of these pens, and I think I'm responsible for much of Yale assuming this, but it is the world's greatest pen. So anyway, I'm holding this pen, and let's say that the Lord speaks to me and commands me to write down a message unto his people. Amen. And so I take this pen and I write down the things that are dictated to me by the divine spirit. The pen is the instrument by which the things are written down, but it's an external instrument because the pen is not me. It's something other than me. My hand is also the instrument by which I write this thing down, but it's an internal instrument because my hand is not something that I have in the deepest sense. It actually is me, right? Like it's my hand in the sense that it's the part of me that's a hand, or one of the 2 parts of me that's a hand anyway.
If you hit someone, you can't say, well, my hand did it.
Right. And well, never mind. I thought it was you, but it was just your hand. No. The hand counts as you because it's an internal instrument. And that's one of the places where Father Wesley's saying that because he knows what I'm on about here. That's one of the ways they deploy it is in ethical questions, right? How do you assign responsibility for something? And if I stab somebody with the pen, I stab them to death with the pen because the pen's mightier than the sword. Even though the pen did it, but the pen was in my external instrument, and so we still pass through the responsibility to the one wielding the instrument. Okay, so why am I talking about this? Well, I'm talking about it in part because I think that this notion of non-observational knowledge of states of affairs that are true of me has something to do with this notion of internal instrumentation, right? I don't have to think about the fact that I'm curling my fingers around the pen in order to pick up the pen and write with it. And you might argue, well, you know that that's happening because you have the sensations, but the reality is I'm actually not aware of the sensations unless I think about them. Most of the time when I write with a pen or type, I am unaware consciously of the physical sensations involved because they've become second nature. And so they just have sunk to the level of subconsciousness, even if at the highest level of subconsciousness. And so what's coming into issue here, it seems to me, is the question of chains of intention, right? Like, obviously, if we think about it from an Aristotelian standpoint, and I do that because I keep trying to connect her back to texts and ideas that will be more familiar in the types of discussions, classical discussions that we're all engaged in all the time. So Aristotle will talk about a final cause. And the final cause is that for which you do something, right? I buy these flowers in order that my girl may be happy with me, right? There's a whole bunch of actions involved in getting some flowers for my wife. I've got to select a flower shop, and I've got to, get in the car and, get my keys and get in the car and drive there and go through and select some flowers and pay the lady and bring them back and offer them to my wife at a time when she's home and able to receive them, right? All of those sorts of things. Every one of those things is done for the sake of that end goal of getting something done. And I don't know if it's the simplest account or not, but one account you could give of that is the thing intended is giving the flowers to my wife. Everything else is, let's say, intended secondarily. It's intended as ancillary to that larger thing.
I think that's helpful. And really, I think it may be productive to bring out the four causes as a way of helping us think through intention, because well, I have a theory. I think David Bentley Hart makes this argument in his book Tradition and Apocalypse, where he says basically that the scientific revolution bracketed off questions of efficient or of a formal and final cause.
Yeah.
And then basically over time said, well, since science can't investigate those things, they just don't exist.
Yeah.
But if you apply that anthropologically, then you do run into a mess in terms of intention, because you no longer have final and formal cause to draw from. And so, yeah, you are a mess of intentions. It would be impossible to sort of map out, well, why did the man do that? And so to bring these things out is really helpful. The intention can be, I guess, perhaps most precisely expressed through the final cause, but then in order to achieve the final cause, one must have a formal cause, a sort of plan that one will follow. The man who's going to poison the family through the water supply, right? He has to come up with this plan. And then there's the material cause. It's the poison in the water. And the efficient cause is him pumping the thing. So all of that can be mapped onto the four causes of Aristotle. And so it would be, I think, behoove us to bring those back a little bit more into a lot of these modern discussions, because they help us see something holistically that we can then rightfully distinguish the parts of what's going on, but without diminishing the unity of the intention.
Yeah, that's so helpful, because if you reduce everything to it's got to be either material cause or efficient cause, and then if you select material cause, what do you wind up with? You wind up with behaviorism.
Yep.
And if you select efficient cause, you wind up with causalism, right? Which are the things she's trying to avoid. And so in a real sense, that diagnosis that the ills of modern understandings of the world can be traced to the scientific rejection of originally bracketing, because we can't view the formal and final causes. And so it's not that they don't exist, it's just that they aren't the objects of science, which is true. But then when you go from science to scientism and you say that, well, the only things that are real are the things that are the objects of science, then they get excluded entirely. That demonstrably renders human action incoherent, right? Because one thing science cannot account for is consciousness. And yet consciousness is something that no one thinking about it rightly can deny, because they're thinking about it and therefore they have consciousness. Right. I think that's super helpful. So Anscombe is then looking at trying to restore this. And what's fascinating to me, and I think this is one of the things that makes her ahead of her time in the late 50s when these lectures were first given, is that her intuition is that you don't want to succumb to the temptation of reducing it to purely mental states, intention. To say that actually you don't even just want to, he says you don't even want to start with the mental states. Where's that bit at? Let's see if I can find this passage. I know roughly.
While you're doing that, I'll just add a supplementary comment to what we've been saying, which I think when you do have this kind of scientism that infiltrates into anthropology, what you get is a really heavy emphasis on the social sciences of like sociology, psychology, etc., which have a purpose and a role. I'm not saying they're bad, but they're also not the ultimate explainer of everything human, though they sometimes act like they are.
Yeah, that's right. Let's see here. It's right about, I know what side of the page it's on. Well, I'll just summarize what she's going to say. She says that there's a temptation to think that when we give an account of intention, we ought to begin with the mental and only then go on to the physical. And she says, but I think it's exactly the opposite, that we ought to start with the physical and work our way back to the mental. I think one of the reasons that's so important to her is that she recognizes that if the account starts with the mental, it's very likely to end there as well. The physical will never come into it. Whereas if it starts with the physical, you can't reduce it out. Why do I say that's ahead of her time for 1950? Well, there was while at the same time that science is insisting, or rather that science is doing no such thing, but the scientism is insisting that the only types of things there are physical observable things, material observable things. There was also a strong tendency in philosophy of mind, with a pedigree going back to Descartes, to divorce the mental states from the physical, and to think that they were just two separate things entirely. And so you could imagine a bodiless consciousness drifting through a void, nevertheless being a consciousness and having all the thoughts and whatever that it wants to have. Later on, it's really in some ways contributed to by things like the feminist movement, and some other contextual movements. There's a move back to saying, listen, the physical aspects of humanity are not accidental to what it means to be human. They're essential. Originally, this argument was used to argue that being a woman matters to your experience of the world. It's a fundamentally different type of experience of the world to what men has. This argument has been undercut in more contemporary days by the ways that gender is talked about now, where you want to push back against gender essentialism and say, well, being a woman is a matter of feeling like a woman and not a matter of the physical. But that's actually antithetical to the original feminist project, and I think to what was good about that first feminist project. Not saying all of it was good, but like everything, there's good stuff in it, right? So for Anscombe to be pushing on that, knocking on that particular door in the 50s, is ahead of where the intellectual community as a whole was. There would be another 30 years before people really caught up to this type of analysis. I think that's really helpful, because what it does is that, I'm going to bring it all back around to the four causes discussion now, is it makes it, we're not saying, and Anscombe, well, we're not saying that Anscombe's not saying, we're not saying that Anscombe's saying that what you want to do is get rid of the material and the efficient cause and just focus on the formal and final cause. She really does want an account that takes into account all of those aspects of causality that Aristotle talks about, that they've each got a role to play, not just in the action being performed, here's the revolutionary part, but specifically in intention. That it's wrong to reduce intention simply to final cause either, but that these other aspects have to be there.
When we want to do something, so if I have a plan to, I don't know, write an article or an essay, right, I will come up first with a sort of final cause for it. What is the purpose of what's the thesis that I want to argue for? And then the formal cause, right, I will I'll map it out, I'll do an outline, and then I'll use I'll get the material cause, I'll get my computer, I'll get my books that I need to make the argument present, and then I'll do the efficient cause of typing the argument out and wrestling with it and eventually creating an article that you might submit somewhere or something. That's true from the perspective of I'm going to do a plan. But if you have to, I don't know, if you're a detective and you're trying to figure out, well, who committed the murder and why, you do have to kind of reverse engineer it, right?
Yeah,
what does the evidence say? Who was the actor? And then why would they do it? To what purpose? And so,
in a sense, you start with the material effects of the deed, not the material cause, and then you work your way. You use those to work your way back to an approximation of what the formal cause might have been. What was his plan here? Right? Why did these things come about? And then you use that to figure out, okay, what type of efficient cause would have accomplished this sort of a thing? And it ends with a motive. This person, this group of people who all are the right sort of person to have done this, they all have the relevant expertise or whatever else. This one has a reason, a final cause for doing it.
I think in doing this, one of the things I appreciate about the book, and it took me a while to kind of realize this, but I do think Anscombe is advocating for a kind of humanism here, because she is recognizing the complexity of a human person without taking away certain essential features of being a human person. So we've talked about the problem with just living up in your head. We've talked about the problem with blaming someone's actions purely on the sort of structure or environment in which they were raised. But those things are there and they're true. I mean, they do influence people, right? We can look at someone who makes bad choices and say, well, it's quite possible that their parents didn't teach them very well, or that there was some experience in their past that caused them to do this. But it doesn't take away from, I think, a really important emphasis on the human person as such. And that's what she's doing. Whereas what she's pushing up against highlights those views of causalism and behaviorism, highlight aspects of being human, but in so emphasizing one aspect of the human experience, they kind of lose sight of the rest of it, right?
Yeah.
And so she is able to bring it back to where we can appreciate the full human person and all the complexities that come with that being human. And I greatly appreciate that, and I would expect that from a sort of Thomistic Catholic professor in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Well, some of them, not all of them. Maybe not the neo-Thomist ones, but some of them.
Proper Thomist ones.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And what's interesting, folks, Thomas is someone who is read a lot by analytical philosophers. And one of the reasons that my training was analytical was because my original graduate advisor, Marilyn McCord Adams, was her expertise was medieval philosophy, and through Aquinas and Scotus and Occam and those guys, she learned philosophy, and that was sort of the way things were done. But there's been a pushback in more recent years to say, well, it's a bit ahistorical to read Thomas as being an analytical philosopher when he's a lot more well-rounded than that. Right? He predates the split into these two different ways of doing philosophy. And one easy way to make that argument is to say, well, he may be an Aristotelian, but that doesn't mean he's not a Platonist.
Right.
And which I think is true. And then of course there are these arguments about how Platonist was he, right? He's so Platonist that, I find those more or less appealing depending on the particular argument, more or less applicable to Aquinas. But nevertheless, I do think the critique is a good one, that there's a way in which he gets shifted into, he's being read in a particular sort of way that isn't the best way to read him. The difference is precisely the type of thing that Anscombe's on about here about our intentions. It's about paying attention to the entirety of the reality, to all the things that go into it, and reducing that to just the mental or just the physical or just this type of mental versus other or whatnot, is not a winning strategy for understanding why this concept gets applied in all these seemingly equivocal situations, for example.
Yeah, that's helpful. Anything else we should talk about here in this book?
Do you have any thoughts on her thoughts about animal intentions?
I not off the top of my head. Do you? I'm assuming you do if you brought it up.
No, I almost do. It's not fully formed yet. But when I was reading that bit, it reminded me of a bit in C.S. Lewis's novel That Hideous Strength, where he's talking about the bear, Mr. Boltitude. And he actually says this in prose and other places as well, that his conception of animal consciousness is that animals are not conscious in any meaningful way that we use that word, but rather they have these desires, which I think he would be comfortable calling intentions, but they all are disconnected from the why question. Right. So there's the presence of the desire for food, but there's no because I want to continue existing or something like that that goes with it. There's no higher order reflection on it. And so they just move from desire to desire, which has always struck me as a pet owner. It's always struck me as a insufficient explanation of animal behavior. It feels like there's more going on. There's more planning, and also something that looks suspiciously like choosing happening as well in animals. And there's been a lot of studies to test this. And I think the scientific behaviorism would argue against this picture that Lewis is presenting. But as I lay Lewis's picture up against what Anscombe's saying here and the way she connected to animals, it makes me feel like maybe I'm less convinced that Lewis's picture can't be salvaged as a reasonable explanation of animal consciousness, right? That maybe there is something about isolated contextless intentions that could be a good way of describing animal behavior, and anything that seems like it doesn't fit that is actually anthropomorphic. It's us projecting our own ways of looking at the world onto the animals.
I believe somewhere Wittgenstein says that if a lion could speak, we couldn't understand him anyways.
I've been trying to explain this to my son, who's 5, because I understand what my cat wants a lot of the time. And my cat comes to me and meows at me, and I say, you know, I'll get your food in 1 minute. And my son sees that, and he's like, Dad speaks cat, right? Like, and so then the cat will come in and meow, and he'll be like, what's he saying, Dad?
That's funny.
And I remember when I was a kid trying to figure out what the cat was saying and trying to, you know, listening for patterns in the meows and seeing if I could work out the syntax of cat language, you know, not in so many words, but that's what I wanted to do. And it was a big revelation when I realized that they aren't saying anything, right? It's not a language. The meow doesn't mean something specific in the way that cow means something specific in English. The meow is it's more like a baby's cries. It's a general of expression of desire, right? And if I'm willing to accept that, then I've gone a long way towards overcoming my resistance to Lewis's presentation. I'm not saying I'm ready to just say that's the right answer at all, but I found it highly implausible, and I find it less implausible with the help of this book.
Cat intentions are pretty easy to figure out. They either want to control you or kill you.
and dogs just want to be with you.
That's right. They just want to be your friend.
That's right.
Good. Well, excellent. Well, this was a little bit of a different read for us, but I did very much enjoy it. It was a bit of a change of pace, and this has been a lot of fun.
Thanks for picking it.
Yeah. Well, do you have any end notes to add here?
Okay, so I have to admit, this is one of the hardest types of things for me to think about endnoting, because like, what in the world do you do with it? But sorry, excuse me. Oh, yawn there. And see, I told you, Anscombe makes you tired. I'm gonna give a weird one. What was this movie called? There was a movie, and it was called wasn't called Perspectives. Maybe you'll remember this if I describe it. It was a bombing in Spain in like a public square, and they showed you, it was called Witness Testimony. There was you saw the thing play out, and you think you're just watching the movie, and then about 15 to 20 minutes of the movie, it rewinds to before the explosion, and then you're looking at it from a different character's perspective, and then it does that 4 or 5 times. And you come to realize that the way that it seemed to you at first is very different than the way that it is overall. And I think that's interesting, because part of what is at stake is, how do you interpret the intentional actions of people? And you see different ways of interpreting those intentional actions of people. I'll see if I can find the name of that movie by the time you finish telling your sharing.
Sure. Yeah. So 2, I think. Number 1 is if you're interested in learning more about Anscombe or seeing more kind of what influenced her, it can't hurt to go to Wittgenstein and read some of him. So that's a good place to go. But I think my main one would be how I found out about Anscombe, which is Dr. Jennifer Fr, who's the dean of the Honors College at the University of Tulsa. And she has her own podcast, which is really excellent. But she's got some lectures that she's given, I think, through the Thomistic Institute. So if you just Google like Thomistic Institute Jen Fr Anscombe, you can find it. And that's how I found out about Anscombe. And based on her explanation and description of Anscombe's work, I was like, wow, that seems really important. I'd like to read that. And so that was why I ended up putting it on the list of things to read for the classical mind. So nice. Anyway, so you can't go wrong with Wittgenstein or Jen Fr. I think those would be good. Nice. Did you find it?
The movie is called Vantage Point.
Oh, Vantage Point. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Excellent. Well, our next book is Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Nietzsche, and we will also be releasing our draft for the next season very soon. So thank you for listening, and in the meantime, keep reading.